All right. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Victor Torres. I am a consultant from the Indiana IEP Resource Center. I'm from the Northwest Indiana area, so I'm really excited to be here this morning with you guys. I see that I have some Northwest Indiana natives and educators in the virtual room with us this morning. Good morning, Kim. Good morning, guys. Nice to know that you guys are here. We're really excited to be with you guys this morning. I'll go ahead and let Patrick introduce himself, and then we will jump into the content this morning.
All right. Thanks, Victor. Hi, everybody. Great to see you guys, or see at least see your names on here. I'm Patrick McKinley, the research director with the Indiana IEP Resource Center, and like Victor, I am based up in Northwest Indiana. Our office is in Gary, so it's good to see all of you, not just you in the region, but it is particularly nice to see you folks there too, because we work with you, tend to work with you a little bit more. So it's great to see everybody. We've got over 40 people on here. That's awesome. So
Mhm.
we'll be getting started here in a little bit, and hope you enjoy the training and have access to the Padlet, and you can use some of those resources that we're providing to you.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, Patrick, if you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide, and we'll kind of look at some of the agenda for today. So we're doing our welcome and introductions. Then we're going to spend some time today looking through the MTSS framework. We're going to spend a specific amount of time on each of the domains, look at some of the components of each of the domains, some principles, and then also look at some infrastructure and implementation considerations. On the next slide here, you will see some of our learner objectives. So we hope that by the end of our time today, you guys will be able to identify some benefits, components, and principles of MTSS, identify where you can look to devote your greatest energy, all of to have the most impact for all of our students, all of our learners. And then we're also going to identify some considerations for implementation success. On the next screen here, you're going to see that, Patrick, if you could pull up that Padlet and we can walk them through where, there we go. Yep. So on the very left-hand side there, the first column, there is a copy of the PowerPoint PDF. For some of you that may be new or are not as familiar with Padlet, if you hover over each of those documents, it will allow you to download to your device, or you can open up in another window. The other document that I just want to highlight briefly is in the resources. We've provided, this is something that an activity that we do within district with the buildings, or as I said, with whole districts, where we like to just give people an opportunity to document what you already have in place for each of those domains. So if you download this document, it is an editable PDF. So as we're going, Patrick and I, through the framework, feel free for your own practice, for your own reflection, go ahead and list some components of each of the domains that perhaps you already have, or maybe there's some areas that you're like, we may be lacking a few resources, or maybe looking to maybe tweak or enhance some of our practices. So again, feel free to download that document, and for your own practice, and reflection, document some things that you may already have for that specific domain. All right. We're also going to have some opportunities throughout the presentation where you can comment in the chat box and let us know what are some of the local practices that you have in place. All right. So let's see here. So, team of five, Patrick, do you think we can? You know what? Yeah, we can go into present mode here. I think we've got a video coming up, so I think it would still work. There's a comment in the chat box, Patrick, if we could go into present mode, so it could be a little larger
Okay, so this is
for the
not
group.
full screen. I
Yeah,
was
I think it's
okay.
in read view.
Okay,
Mhm.
we'll try it. Let's see if this works.
Yep.
I've got multiple screens here, so it tends to move things around. So I don't know if you can see it not, now or not.
Yeah, I think it may be better in the view you had because it's showing
Yeah.
your the notes or your one of your other monitors.
So let's share the screen. Screen one. All right. Nope. Sorry about this, guys. Display. This happens just about every time when I try to go in present mode. Let me see if I can change some of my settings here
All
for
right.
my display. Sorry about this.
No, you're all right. In the meantime, guys, I'll post the Padlet in the chat box again, and that has a copy again of the PowerPoint PDF, and then also that document that you guys can work through as we move through the domains of the framework.
Okay, let me try this again.
There we go.
All right, can we see that?
Yeah, that's good. Yep. Cool. Hopefully that's a little easier for the
Yeah,
group
sorry
that's
about that. It's
looking
yeah, for
together.
some reason my computer is a little finicky.
No worries. All right. Well, we went through our objectives. Let's go ahead and we're going to watch a brief 3-minute video here just to kind of get our core beliefs. We like to start off with this to just kind of get everybody in the mindset of MTSS and really looking to have an inclusive culture within your buildings and within your local practices. So go ahead, Patrick, and hit play. By the way, too, if it starts to lag for some of you,
Hi, my name is Shelly Moore, and I'm a third-year PhD student.
Never mind. Their cameras aren't on. Go ahead and press play, Patrick. Sorry.
As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing the strength in our diversity. This value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregates students by ability, especially students with developmental disabilities. There's a gap in our understanding about what we know inclusive education to be, philosophically, versus what we understand and the importance of understanding inclusion in our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research, is how can we find the value in the day-to-day practice in our classrooms in terms of inclusive education? So how am I gonna explain this to you? Now I can sit here and try and describe this, or we could have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. The goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, what often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? The ball was the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle, we do the best we can. The pins that are left standing, we often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, those 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support and are kids who need the most challenge. So we end up choosing one, and the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling, and let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They throw the ball down the lane at a curve. And I was actually really curious about this, so I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest to hit. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach to the kids who are the furthest and the hardest to get to, the kids with autism, the kids with Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with Universal Design for Learning, is that so often the supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids need. This is the part we need to understand if inclusive education is going to move forward in Canada. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms between the students? This is not just important for the outside pins, but it's critical for every single one of us. And just think, all we need to do is change our aim. Look how bowling changed education.
All right. Thank you, Patrick, for sharing that with us. So right now, if we would have been in person, we would have went through this activity where we would have had 4 poster boards listed throughout the room. And on each of those posters, we would have had one of these 4 core beliefs listed. And we would have had you as a group kind of walk through and just list some look fors, some listen fors. What do each of these beliefs look like in your local practices? You know, what does it feel like, look like, sound like? What is the staff attitude and belief that every child learns and achieves to high standards? Or how are we ensuring that learning is including not only academic, but social competencies as well? What does it look like that every member of our educational community is continuing to grow, learn, and reflect? And how are all of us ensuring, as a school community, as the leaders of that building, how are we holding each other accountable and responsible for every one of those every one of our children? So we like to do this activity because, again, it really kind of just changes the mindset and just helps us shift into that inclusive culture again, whereas Shelly mentioned in the video, you know, we're looking to meet the needs of not only our general ed, special ed, ELL, all of our students for that matter. And essentially that's one of the core beliefs and the benefits of using MTSS in our practices, because again, we're looking to meet the needs of all of our students using a whole child approach. All right, so on the next slide here, you're going to see, oh, well, actually right now we're going to take a few seconds and in the chat box, just to kind of help Patrick and I kind of get a glimpse of where everybody is at as far as their knowledge and their background knowledge and where you're at potentially in the MTSS implementation within your districts. We would like to know, we'll take about a minute or two here in the chat box, just kind of tell us, what do you know already about MTSS? What do you think you know? And if there's some of us that are new to this process, feel free to say, hey guys, not much. We just know it's an acronym, MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, right? Go ahead and in the chat box and just tell us in a couple of brief words, what do you already know about MTSS? And again, as Kelly, feel free to tell us, we're new to this process. We're just getting started. So we'll wait about a minute or two here. Just want to see where you guys are at. We've got a couple of, oh, this is awesome. New to the process, brand new to me, okay. Not much, awesome, okay. Not much, okay, awesome. This is good. We're excited that you guys took some time out of your busy schedules to spend some time with us this morning. So we're really excited that you are in your local practices looking to implement and get started with this framework. So we got definitely culturally responsible as a part, yeah. Informal understanding or a practical one. Using some RTI, okay. Struggles is okay. Okay, so looking for some clarification. Needs using a whole child approach. So we got tier 1, tier 2. Yep, that's MTII. We'll definitely break that framework down as well. New to the concept. Oh, we've got somebody using some data here. Awesome. To see some trends, using it to support our kids. So we've got awesome. So we've got some Kelly has some knowledge there on using the tiers, right? Tiered supports for our students using small group in tier 2, tier 3, more intense. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for sharing. It's really helping Patrick and I kind of see the range of where we're at as far as our implementation within our districts. We got a first-year teacher in the room. All right, shout out to you, Jessica. Yeah, woo, awesome. Thanks for being with us this morning. Culture shift, embrace, yeah. Mix of some PBIS, RTI, SEL. Using data again, yeah, that's definitely a huge piece that Patrick's going to elaborate more on. Using data to really drive your decision-making process is awesome. Thank you guys so much. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. I see again, we have a nice wide range of participants. So, Patrick and I will ensure that we'll try and be as specific with the breakdown of the domains in the framework. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And again, thank you for being with us this morning throughout this hectic time. I know you guys have a lot going on, probably a laundry list of a to-do list. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking time out this morning to learn, to spend some time with us, and also, just continue to develop your practices and your knowledge on MTSS. All right. So on this next slide here, you are going to see um, the reason why, per se, that we're hearing, some of these acronyms as UDL, Universal Design for Learning, or MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. And it's because this framework here has been embedded in Indiana's ESSA plan as kind of like our North Star, per se, a framework that we're going to use to, implement any inclusive model when we're talking about UDL or MTSS. And we kind of took out that centerpiece and highlighted it on the left side of your screen, where you see that when we have these three components intertwined together of shared responsibility, accountability, and high expectations for all of our students, we're then looking to ensure that we have an equitable, inclusive model within our buildings and education that is allowing all of our students access to the general education environment, to the general education curriculum, which then leads to more positive outcomes for all of our students. So using this framework here is, going to help us in leading to those positive outcomes and increased, closing those academic and achievement gaps for all of our students. On the next slide here, you will see a few of the guiding principles that are in our plan for MTSS. So, ensuring that, again, that whole child approach, the whole child approach for all of our children, all of our educators are embedded into this process, where we're having leadership driven expectations and just setting those high standards for all of our students. Somebody mentioned in the chat box, culturally responsive practices, ensuring that we're integrating, all of our practices together with our school improvement initiatives and plan as well. So here are just some of the guiding principles through MTSS that are listed in our Indiana ESSA plan. On the next screen here, I just want to give you guys a brief moment to just kind of see this paradigm shift that, at times it's difficult for us as educators, but it's really a mind shift change, where we start thinking from a within child approach, what is it about the student that is causing the problem, to really shifting our mindset and our beliefs and our thought process on what is it about the school environment, what is it that us as the educators of that school community, what can we do to really, really create the most best, rich, optimal learning conditions for our students within the building. So whether we're doing virtual, a remote hybrid approach, what is it that we can do, shifting our focus on what's within our control, within our reach, to create the most rich learning experience for all of our students. So, this is definitely a mindset shift that has to occur, but it's so essential in the implementation and sustaining, an inclusive model and culture as MTSS, and using that framework within our buildings and our districts. All right, so on the next screen here, you are going to see the framework, the MTSS framework that we use, and each of the domains. So we're going to spend some time breaking down each of these components. And again, as we work through, we're going to have some time embedded where you can list in the chat box, what are some things that you have in place already within your building or within your districts for each of the domains. But if you would like, feel free to pull up the other document from the Padlet and type in some things within your local practice. This is something, again, that we do within district with buildings to just kind of helps and reflects and to see, what are some things that we have in place? What can we look to tweak and enhance? All right. So the very first domain that we're going to look at is the leadership one. So on the next screen, you will see some of the components of the leadership domain. And really, when we talk about leadership, it's that school-based leadership team, and when creating and assembling that leadership team, we want to ensure that it's cross-disciplinary, that we have representatives, stakeholders from all of the areas, where it's not seen as just a special ed thing or a general ed thing. It's all of us together. So ensuring that you have representatives from, school counselors, social workers, your administrators, right, leadership team, having some of your teacher leaders, instructional coaches, just individuals and stakeholders that can really provide a good lens and perspective on what is the climate and the culture of the building. When we're the team, the school-based leadership team will also look at aligning their MTSS plan with their school improvement plans. And this school-based leadership team will also actively look to facilitate and implement their plan, throughout. So whether you're holding weekly, bi-monthly meetings to just kind of actively facilitate and implement those practices within your building and ensuring that you are keeping, making gradual progress to meeting and reaching your goals. All right. Patrick, you can go ahead and go on to the next screen. That's a really brief one with leadership. It's again just ensuring that you have that a core team put together that's really helping and ensuring that there's active implementation. Now, moving into capacity building infrastructure, in this domain, we see. You can go ahead, Patrick. Yep, and move on to the next one. In this domain, we're looking. The school-based leadership team is really looking to actively facilitate professional development and coaching for all of the staff. So really, they're ensuring that within their PLCs, they're ensuring that the staff, whether maybe using like a needs assessment or talking to their teachers, having a constant communication and collaboration. What are the needs of our staff? What is our data showing that could be some potential training opportunities? This team is also ensuring that the schedule is active and that it's really meeting the needs of the students. So we're not only talking about the scheduling of classes and of the day, but also ensuring that you have scheduled time for your school-based leadership team, for your PLCs to come together and meet and collaborate, whether it's, within grade levels or specific content, ensuring that there's time for teachers and administrators and coaches to not only come together and plan, but also do data dives and ensuring that it's all a fluid process. When looking at capacity building infrastructure, we also want to ensure that our staff as a whole, that we have a common language and understanding of MTSS, that our everybody knows their role and where they stand as a part of this process. One key component of capacity building infrastructure is also looking at ensuring that you have processes, procedures, and decision rules. When we talk about MTII, multiple tiers of instruction and intervention, how are we, providing supports to students? What are some of those benchmarks and guidelines that we know that, okay, potentially we may need to provide some tier 2 or tier 3 support? So as we'll mention, once we get to that domain, it's really important here that as that leadership team, that you are reviewing those decision-making rules and processes, and also taking time to see what are the resources that we have available to help our MTSS implementation. On the next screen, you will see a couple of other components of CBI. And again, just ensuring, as I mentioned on the previous screen, our scheduling, ensuring that we have adequate time for trainings, for coaching supports, database problem solving and decision making, really having time, set time to have data evaluation, as Patrick will elaborate more within the next few minutes here. So just a couple of more components, of CBI. So this one's got quite a few pieces, but as you'll see as we move on, a lot of them are all intertwined together. But I feel like this one is very important, to taking time as that school-based leadership team to looking at what are the resources available to support our implementation. And again, really taking time to look at those processes, procedures, and decision rules that they're established, and we have everybody is aware of those processes. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the virtual microphone off to Patrick, and he's going to lead you through the next few domains here. All right.
Okay, thanks, Victor. So the next domain we're talking about is communication and collaboration. And we know that this is going to be a very crucial component to making sure that MTSS is actually working and you're able to successfully implement it. So with leadership and capacity building infrastructure, you're putting those pieces in place. You've got those things that you need, those components that you need, and the structure that you need, whether it be the structure of the people involved or the structure in terms of the resources that you have and the scheduling and staffing and all of that. The communication and collaboration brings that together with actions, right? We need to make sure that we are communicating and collaborating effectively, and we have some of those channels of communication developed so that they are working properly, so that you can make the decisions that are necessary in an MTSS, do the problem solving, and provide tiered supports to students in the other domains as well. So what we're talking about here are some key considerations for communication and collaboration. So you want to make sure that staff have consensus and engagement in the MTSS implementation process. So when it comes to consensus, we want to have a consensus on a few different things. The why we're doing MTSS in the first place, right? What are the goals of MTSS? What are the needs that we're trying to fulfill with an MTSS? It kind of goes back to the beliefs that Victor mentioned early on, some of those foundational beliefs that we want to have in place. Those attitudes and beliefs really shape the MTSS that you have in your system, in your building or in your district. And that can really make or break the entire system. A lot of times that's going to be the source of the motivation that you have to making sure that the strategies that are being implemented with fidelity and are actually aligned to those needs. A lot of times it's the lack of consensus and the lack of engagement that get us to that point. A lot of times we move forward with an initiative like MTSS or maybe RTI or PBIS with varying levels of understanding as to what the goal is for that initiative that we're doing. And so we've got a lot of different people doing a lot of different things, and some people might be doing some great things. Other folks might not really have a clue what they're doing, but they've been told they had to do this, so that's why they're doing it. And so they think they're doing it the same way, but without the communication, the regular communication and collaboration with the other folks that are involved, whether it be those that are implementing those strategies, those that are planning and developing those strategies, or any other players that are involved in this process, they all need to be at the same table and understand what their role is in the entire process and in the framework as a whole. Sharing of data. We need to make sure that the staff are provided with the adequate data that they need to ensure that MTSS is implemented effectively. So that's going to be the student outcome data, looking at assessment data, making sure they have access to that. It's shared with them, and that's regularly communicated. And also making sure that you're collecting fidelity data on the fidelity of those initiatives or of those interventions that are being implemented, whether it be tier 1 interventions for all students or any of the other tiered levels of interventions that are being provided to students. Infrastructure to support school goals. Make sure that that infrastructure is in place so that those goals and those objectives can be adequately addressed. And so this goes for your goals and your objectives for the school and the district, no matter what you're doing. If it's MTSS, right? This is not an exception. This is something you want to make sure that you have in place for everything that you're doing. And making sure that we're making use of the technology that you have. You want to, one of the advantages here of virtual environment that a lot of us have had to become a little bit more familiar with over this past year or so, is it's kind of forced us to become a little bit more reliant and a little more comfortable with some of those technological tools that we have, and making use of the ones that are working well for us and ditching those that are no longer working, because we really need it, right? Right now, we know we really need it. And so I think as we're kind of transitioning into maybe more of a hybrid or hopefully relatively soon in-person instruction for a lot of the schools here, if you're not doing so already, taking those tools that are working effectively in some of those virtual environments and making use of those or tweaking them, adapting them to that in-person setting, because you've gotten to a point where you've been comfortable with those tools, and maybe they've been helping with allowing you to communicate a little bit more efficiently. So just making sure that you're taking advantage of those and communicating what's working with a lot of the tools that we schools. You've got certain teachers that might be using really effective tools that could be effective in other classrooms or in other settings or environments, but that just hasn't been communicated. And sometimes we think, oh, well, we have an advantage because we know how to use this tool. But as we know in education, I think it benefits everybody if we communicate those things. So definitely celebrate the things that are working for you, and try to encourage other folks to be using some of those things as well. But make sure that's shared and that's intentional. Kind of goes back to the foundation of this domain, communication and collaboration, making sure we're intentional with these communication efforts, and that we have scheduled times that are allocated to sharing a lot of that information. And the last one here, family and community engagement. That piece is really huge here, and a lot of times that ends up being overlooked. Or taken for granted that the families and communities are involved or are aware of the process. So think of this in terms of how you want to share that out with the communities. The SS for families, or the friendly communication or language there. It's really all in how you frame that messaging, but also making sure that you're intentional about sending out that message and communicating with families, what this is, what is MTSS, like I said, in a language that's really friendly to them. What is different in MTSS compared with what the students had been getting or what their children had been receiving in the past? How is this different? How does this impact their kids? What types of supports are available, talking about the academics, behavior, social, emotional, the whole child approach and all of that. I think that's really going to help bridge that gap between what's happening in the home and what's happening in the school. I think it's really going to help get parents and families on board and get them a little bit motivated to doing this and understanding their role in this, because there's certainly going to be a very important piece in this whole process. And of course, communicating with them on how their students are performing. How are they performing in relation to their goals, in relation to where we're expecting their student or their children to be. So a lot of things to consider here with communication. We just really need to make sure that we're intentional with this stuff and not just assuming that the communication is taking place. I think a lot of times that's an overall assumption here is, oh, well, we gave them the tools to communicate. Let's just assume that that's happening and then we'll move forward. But as we know, a lot of times that just kind of falls apart if we're not really intentional with structuring some times. And that kind of goes to the first point here, making sure that we're scheduling regular meetings for these cycles and for these communication cycles, talking about the data and talking about the strategies, the interventions, what we're using, what's working and what's not. Maybe we're not implementing with the fidelity, the level of fidelity that maybe others are who are maybe being a little bit more successful with some of those strategies. And when it comes to, the communicating and the sharing of information, that's not just within your school, that's among the schools within your district at all levels, elementary and secondary. And there's a potential to communicate your strategies and your implementation with other districts that are similar to your own in size, demographics, types of resources that you have access to, or those that are close to you geographically. Maybe you're in a special ed co-op and you've got some other districts that are doing similar things or that you can learn from. So there's plenty of opportunities to communicate and collaborate here at all levels. So I think most of these items here I've kind of covered already, so I'm gonna kind of skip through these bullet points, kind of reiterates what I've already been saying. And I want to give you an opportunity here to have, typically we'd have a small group discussion in person, but since we're virtual, we want to get your thoughts in the form of the chat box or the chat window here in the Zoom platform, your thoughts on these first 3 domains that we've covered: leadership, capacity building, infrastructure, communication, collaboration. So what are some of the existing structures, assets, procedures that you're using in your schools? It doesn't matter if this is for MTSS, for anything that you can leverage and make use of within an MTSS. Because as Victor mentioned, this is about using what you already have that's working and not, recreating the wheel, because we know we don't really need to do that. There's a lot of pieces in here in an MTSS that you're already doing. So just going to give you a couple minutes here. Going to play a little bit of a song. This is actually a song that Victor arranged and recorded himself. So we'll give him credit for that. And just start thinking about, typing some of the things that you're already doing in terms of these 3 domains. Okay, we got Trina saying she works in a co-op. Going down a little bit here. Struggles with each of the schools being at different levels with MTSS and behavior. Okay, yeah, different levels within the different stages within implementation, I'm assuming is what is being implied here. And I think that probably is a pretty big struggle, especially in co-ops when we're all in different places and doing different things, and you've got a lot of students that are in varying districts and schools based on their needs, and making sure we've got a common language. And I think sometimes that's really difficult, because we oftentimes see some different definitions or different assumptions from district to district or from school to school and what an MTSS is. So that's definitely a challenge, but I think that's where communication can certainly come into play, and you can benefit from that. Monthly meetings, weekly, looking at discipline. Yeah. And I'm assuming with the discipline, we're talking about, the behaviors and some of the data that we're collecting on student behaviors, which is definitely going to be very, very key to this. Meeting regularly to discuss student data. Great. Are we doing academic data, behavior data, and social emotional data? A lot of times we do academics. We're very intentional about scheduling those communications of those data meetings for academics, but not so much with some of the behavior and social emotional stuff. Of course, that's not always the case, but usually we tend to focus on the individual students with those things. We're not always being intentional about scheduling data meetings looking at behavior and social emotional data, but I think for a lot of districts, that's kind of the next step. Monthly MTSS meetings. Victor, why don't you ever play for us at conferences? He's a one-man band. I don't know how you do it.
Oh my gosh. I see there's another comment here too. We've been working to develop and roll out universal procedures. So all of our districts are using the same language and practice. That's awesome. It's definitely a great practice there.
Yeah, we work with some districts that are kind of in the initial stages of implementation. There's a lot of different ways to go about doing that, and a lot of different entry points, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But there's been some interest in that, as you're developing the procedures and the handbook and the expectations, that's helping you design what your MTSS is going to look like. So that's definitely one way to go about it.
Yeah. Awesome. No, these are great. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, looks like we're on to the next song. So that means we need to move on here. Okay, so the next domain we're talking about here is the problem-solving process. So this is the movement. This is where we're seeing decisions being made. This is what I think of as the engine that kind of drives the entire MTSS process. So you're not going to be seeing any movement, seeing any decisions being made within this triangle that we're all familiar with, the pyramid, the MTSS, without using a problem solving process. So like I said, it drives everything that you're doing. All of the actions that take place in an MTSS, right? They're the result of this process. And this problem solving process, you're probably familiar with some processes like these, but we want to make sure that these are processes. This is a process that provides some structure to your data meetings. As many of you mentioned, you do have regular data meetings, which I think is great. But a lot of times we find out that, we've got teams that are meeting on data and there's no actions as a result of those data. Or maybe it ends up being more of a gripe session, or we leave the meeting with more questions than answers. So this allows us to be very structured in what our expectations are within those meetings, so that we can problem solve as a team. I think a lot of us consider ourselves pretty good problem solvers individually, and I think a lot of us are great problem solvers, especially if it's within our individual scope of influence, like a classroom or a group of students that we work with. But problem solving as a team is kind of a whole different animal. That's why it's definitely important to make sure you've got some decision making protocols and a process that you're using to walk yourself through that, so that it basically tells you what to do based on the data that you're seeing and the actions that you're going to be taking there. So like I said, this is a cyclical process. This might look a little bit familiar to many of you as we kind of go into some of those steps. So the basics here of database problem solving, we'll get a little bit with too much in depth. It occurs across all tiers, content areas, and grade levels. So we're using a problem solving process for individual students. For classroom level, we're using it at content area, grade levels, school levels, and district levels. So we want to make sure that we're doing this, and we're doing this at the appropriate times and the appropriate intervals as necessary, so that we can make those changes. It's used to identify the gap. So that's the gap between where we are, where data is telling us where we are, and where we want to be. So it's that comparison between the observed trajectory of the student compared with what's the expected trajectory of that student in relation to the goal. And it's used to identify the reason for the gap, which we'll get into a little bit. So kind of coming up with some hypotheses as to why the issue is occurring, why the students are not learning at the level that we're expecting them to, right? And it's used to guide instructional decisions. So we can't really know what we need to do or how we need to teach students or at what level or what intensity until we really determine what the need is. And how do we do that? Well, we really have to drill down or dig into that root cause of the problem itself, which sometimes is easier said than done. But as you become familiar with this process, I think it becomes more natural to dig into what those root causes could be, or what some of those potential root causes could be. So this graphic kind of just illustrates what I was describing on that previous slide about how this problem solving cycle is used to drive all decisions within an MTSS pyramid. All that pyramid that I'm sure, well, I guess we haven't gotten much into this yet, but we will in a little bit here when Victor talks about the multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. So kind of jumping the gun with this graphic here, but it does explain the essential 4 steps of this process. So as I mentioned, there are other processes out there that are going to look familiar to you and that are going to involve these 4 core components. And so the very first one here, what we're doing is defining what the problem is. So we're defining really 2 things here. What is the goal? So what are we expecting students to know? And then what is the problem, right? how are the students performing in relation to that goal. So we need to make sure we've got our goal and our expectations. So with academics, that's a lot easier because usually that's already determined for us with the standards. Sometimes with behavior, it's a little more locally decided. You know, what are our expectations for behavior for all of our students, and then for social emotional. So like I said, it's using this process for all three of those areas, not just for academics. Second step, okay, so once we've identified what the problem is for this student or for these groups of students, then we're trying to determine what is the root cause of that problem? Why is that problem happening? And we've got plenty of tools that we can provide you to do that. You can do the 5 whys. Why is this happening? Okay, well, why was that happening? Why was that happening? To try to get down to the root cause. Look, we've got some tools that can allow you to look at some of the variables in terms of instruction, curriculum, environment, whether it be internal or external environment within the school or outside of the school, and then the student variables, just to kind of get you thinking and brainstorming as a team. A lot of times we go into this process with a lot of assumptions, but of course we want to make sure that we're going back and looking at data as we're going through this process. So in that first step, we probably have a lot of data that we'll be looking at to define what the problem is. But in order to analyze, there might be some other data sources we look at. Maybe there's an academic problem, but we need to look at behavior data to make sure that there are not some behavior variables that are impeding the student's learning. And of course, we can see that in the other way around as well. Step is implementing, right? So that's what we're going to do about it. That's kind of aligning those supports, those interventions with the student need or the problem area, and making sure that we're addressing that root cause of the problem with that intervention, right? And then the last step is evaluating it. So once we've implemented the plan, we've designed it, implement it, everybody that's involved in implementing it is aware of their role and what they're going to be doing. We know what data we're going to be collecting. So now it's coming back to the table, looking at the data to determine if the intervention or the plan or the strategy that we're using, if that's working, if that's effective. And if it is effective, great, maybe we continue to continue what we're doing. If it's not, maybe we make some adjustments. Maybe the strategy or the intervention is not appropriately aligned to the problem, or maybe the issue is the fidelity with which the intervention is being implemented in the first place. So there could always be a combination there as well. But as I said, it's a cyclical process. So after you look at the data to evaluate if it's working, you go back into defining what the problem is. Okay, is this still a problem? Are there any other problems we need to be looking at or need to be addressing? We don't want to overlook any of those other areas. So, and like I said, you want to be doing this at all levels. So I think a lot of us are more used to doing this at the individual student level, but what we're kind of asking schools and districts to do here is take a step back and look at more of a macro level. Because we're probably not as familiar with doing that, at least not doing that regularly with academics, behavior, and social and emotional data. And this this is a tool to really help you organize and structure those meetings, as I said, to look at trends and patterns with all of your students and subgroups of students for certain demographics of students to make sure that you're not overlooking any equity issues that might be in existence in your building or your district. So the problem solving process, some other points here. Student specific goals are monitored. Of course, we're looking at individual students. This is just kind of reiterating what I already said. I guess I jumped the gun a little with with what I was saying here. Performance across specific student groups is monitored. So not just those individuals, but demographic groups, special ed students, English learners, race and ethnicity, making sure you don't have equity issues with socioeconomic status with the free and reduced price meals. We've got a lot of data that we have at our fingertips. It's just making sure that we're making use of this and the best use of this as we can. Because there's a lot of data that we're collecting and there's a lot of data that we're reporting, whether it be to the Department of Ed or you're reporting downtown to your district office, and then you never see it again. But it's making sure that you're actually making use of that data to problem solve. And a lot of times, you don't have to search for additional data sources. A lot of times you have them. It's just a matter of making sure that they're available to you, and you're able to interpret the data and what that's saying. And then, of course, identifying the resources and barriers of implementation, making sure they're monitored and addressed. Those resources are going to definitely come into play when you're developing your plans, right? What are the resources you have available to you? We'll give you a tool for doing that in a little bit here. The barriers are definitely going to be something you'll want to identify when you're doing the problem analysis stage, right? What are the potential barriers for this student or for these groups of students? That's where you're coming up with some of your hypotheses, and then you're looking at some data to validate those hypotheses. Another thing to mention, I think it was in one of the previous slides, just make sure that whatever your plan is, it is within your scope of influence. I mean, we can determine, we're doing a root cause analysis, that there's some issue that's outside of our scope of influence in our school or in our district, and it's a community issue, or it's a bigger issue than something we can take on, which I'm sure a lot of times that is the case, but we, within our schools and districts, we might not really have control over that. So it's making sure that we're addressing not only the root cause, but the root cause that we have influence over. So the last domain we're talking about here, this really plays into the problem solving process, and that's why a lot of times we call it data-based problem solving. We need to make sure that we have the data that we need to sufficiently conduct a problem solving process, right, to make those decisions. So we need to make sure we have a few things here. Make sure staff understand the data that they have access to, but also make sure that they have adequate access to that data. So we're not just talking about assessment data. Even with benchmark assessments like NWEA, yeah, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with looking at that data at a student level, but maybe we're not doing that at a macro level. Maybe we're not familiar with looking at those reports, or taking a step back, looking at the forest through the trees and seeing what some of those big issues are that we might be overlooking, that we might want to address for all of our students. A lot of times we tend to look at, okay, let's provide interventions for these students who need the most help, because they're performing a lot worse than other students, or they're not meeting their goals sufficiently. But maybe we need to take a look at the whole school or the whole system, because we might have some of those same issues with other groups of students, and it might be more of a tier 1 core instruction issue rather than an issue that needs to be intervened with individual students or smaller groups of students. So that's why it's really important that not only we have access to the data, which is crucial for the problem solving process, but we understand the data, we can interpret the data, it's presented in a manner that's really easy to understand and interpret. And that we have some of those sources within our buildings, and within the folks that are involved in your problem solving teams, making sure that they have access as well. At least one person needs to have access to that. So you're not searching around and asking the central office, for some reports that you might not have access to regularly. So you want to make that communication and collaboration a lot easier through the technology. So this should allow you to, do all these things that you want to do in problem solving, identifying the students at risk, monitor growth and progress. So we're not just talking about the benchmark assessment data, also the progress monitoring data for those students that are receiving more intensive interventions, just making sure that all of those are accessible. And a lot of times we overlook some of the data sources that we do have. There's a lot of electronic programs that students are participating in that do have a lot of reports that can be exported and analyzed, and a lot of times they're just not taken advantage of, because maybe we don't realize that they have that. And I think a lot of times that goes into the training, making sure that when we're buying a new data evaluation system or a new data dashboard, that we're training everybody on all of the components. A lot of times our student information systems have a lot of these components built into them, and we're just not taking advantage of them because maybe there wasn't time for training, or maybe there wasn't money to get sufficient training from the vendor. There's a lot of different reasons why this can happen, but it saves you money and time for searching for some other tool that's out there when you might already have something and you may not realize it. Okay, so this, as I said, I'm just kind of reiterates that how data evaluation system is going to help with the problem solving process. You can't do it without it, right? You need to make sure not only they have access and knowledge of the data, but the last point here I didn't mention, make sure that data are monitored for consistency and accuracy. We need to make sure that the data that are being entered, the data entry, is consistent and is accurate, and is current, right? We need to make sure that the data that we're looking at is current and we have that available to us. And how are we going to monitor that for fidelity and for accuracy? You don't need to be doing it every week or every month, but I'd say at least once or twice a year, you need to make sure that things are reliable in terms of the data sources. Otherwise, you're not going to really be able to develop a plan that is data based. Okay, so some more data considerations here. This kind of just reiterates what I've already been saying. Just making sure not only as teachers have access to the data, but they have easy access to the data. And like I said, making sure that they understand it with the training and the decision rules. That's going to really come into play with the problem solving process. Make sure those decision rules are clear, understood, and used. And when we're talking about, when we talk about decision rules, that's really determining what your actions are going to be based on what your data tells you. That's that data evaluation step. That's that last step of the problem solving process. When you're looking at your data to determine, is this working? You're looking at, what's the data telling you? Are you seeing positive growth, negative growth, or neutral growth? And you're also looking at the fidelity data. So it's the outcome data and the fidelity data. Is the intervention being implemented with high fidelity or low fidelity? And you'll set up these decision rules, or you'll establish these rules ahead of time so that you know when you're going through this process what your actions are going to be, because your data, your results are always going to fall into one of those categories. So it's really just deciding, what do we do when this happens? Because one of these things is going to happen. So it makes it a lot easier for you to make those decisions, because it's already kind of made for you. You just have to point out, where we are and what we're seeing, and then what we're going to do is already there for us. Okay. So we've talked about problem solving and data evaluations. So I kind of talked about a lot there, and there's a lot more we could go in depth on, but we want to give you a minute or two to kind of talk a little bit, at least in this chat window, about what you're doing already around problem solving. Do you have problem solving meetings? Do you have data team meetings, whether it be grade level, content area, PLCs? What are you doing already? And what systems do you have in place for data evaluation? Do you have the data that you need to make these decisions? So I'll play a little music here.
I see that we've got a couple of questions with a link available. So
Okay.
At the conclusion of the PD, you'll see an evaluation link to give Patrick and I some feedback. Fill out that evaluation link, and then you will receive a follow-up email from our team that will include a certificate with PGP points for today, and also a recording of today's session. Patrick and I will also be sharing our contact information at the end of the presentation. So feel free to jot that down, and you can reach out to us, and Patrick and I and our other colleagues as well would be more than willing to come into, in your local district with your building and do a similar presentation more geared towards your specific district. So feel free to jot down our contact information at the end. All right.
And as I mentioned, we do have some tools that are available to help you with database problem solving and the decision rules. Don't think we have them in this Padlet, but feel free to reach out if you're interested in any of those tools. It's just some templates and some guiding questions to guide you through that process as you're having those conversations with your teams.
I know, Patrick, we had a question too. Somebody had asked if you could recommend any problem solving models. And I know you walked through some, but again, feel free to reach out to us. And Patrick, he's definitely the data expert. I'm sure he's got tons of resources and models he can share with you guys to help you.
Well, and we offer training on database problem
right.
solving, which is why I went probably in a little more in depth than I needed to for this training on the problem solving process. But we go through what I typically do is go through a case study using the 4-step problem solving process. But I kind of explain the alignment between some of the different evidence-based problem solving processes that are out there. And we actually have a table that kind of shows how those are aligned, like a crosswalk between the different processes, like the PBIS process, the 8-step problem solving process, the PLC one that you might be familiar with if you've been working with those. So there's a lot more we can do with that. It sounds daunting if you're not familiar with it, but once you get more familiar with it, it's second nature. I mean, I use problem solving I apply at least the 4-step problem solving process. It seems like every problem I encounter, I mean, not even just in my regular life, it's just something I do naturally because it just seems so natural.
And I see, I really like, there's a comment in the chat box here. My plan is to take this information back to ask and see what processes do we have in place. And if they don't, then as Patrick mentioned, definitely recommending, to look to embed this practice. Because I really like how Patrick said, like data really is going to drive and gear, which avenue, which lanes, where you want to devote, your greatest energy in meeting the needs of all your learners and increasing those student outcomes. So thank you so much for your comments. And again, my hope is that with these comments in the chat box too, you can kind of get some ideas on what some of the other districts throughout Indiana are using as part of their MTSS implementation and their initiatives. So Patrick, I don't know if we've got a little under 30 minutes. Maybe we can want to move on here to jump into MTII.
All right.
All right, sounds good. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you guys through multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. So, and I know this is kind of the area where, when and even myself, I can recall when we talked about MTSS as a teacher, this is what came to mind, multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. But as you are seeing, there's a whole entire framework that goes into MTSS. And when we talk about, before we move into MTII, we always like to just ensure that everybody has an understanding of a whole child approach. So when we talk about a whole child approach, we're ensuring that all of our students are receiving, that tier 1 universal supports, and not only academics, but also social emotional learning, behavioral components as well. So just to give you a brief example, let's say like we have a student who is performing at grade level in academics. They're strong with reading comprehension and in math fluency. They're able to computate and problem solve. So, they're okay with receiving our first best instruction in tier 1, those universal supports. However, let's say there's a small group of students that is perhaps may have some social skills deficits, or not able to regulate, not truly develop those coping skills. So perhaps for that small group of students, we will look to target them with some more specific instruction on ways that they can cope. So it's kind of like a back and forth model per se. We may have some students who may require more intensive supports in academics, but are okay with just receiving those universal tier 1 supports in those SEL social skills components. So that's what we talk about, a whole child approach, ensuring that we're giving the students the supports and the services they need, not only academically, but ensuring that our SEL components are embedded into our instruction at all these levels. All right. So on the next slide here, you are going to see some of the components of a tier 1. And when we talk about our tier 1 instruction, it's that core universal academic and behavioral instruction that all of our students are going to receive. This is we like to call it our first best instruction. That is that all of our students are going to have access. We want to ensure that, we have evidence-based programs and practices. And we know that our tier 1 instruction, that first best instruction, is effective if at least 80% of our students are meeting those benchmarks. And I know Patrick mentioned earlier, sometimes we like to try and intervene our way out of tier one instruction. We're sometimes at times we can be quick to say, all right, Victor's in need of some tier two supports. But as Patrick mentioned earlier, looking at that data and seeing, is it really our tier one instruction that maybe we need to look to tighten up some and kind of close some of those gaps in our tier one instruction? So it really starts here in our tier one core instruction. So what are some guiding questions? What are some goals that you can look to set, as you're reflecting and thinking about your tier one? It's what do we expect all of our students to learn? How will we know if they've learned it? And how are we going to respond to some of those students who may not be making progress or have already mastered that content? Okay. On the next slide, you're going to see some key elements of our tier one instruction. So again, using data, right? Having those assessments in place. Now in tier one, these are going to be more universal screeners that we're going to have. So for example, using iReady or NWEA, and those are more so like periodic quarterly assessments. I could think about when we used NWEA in my last teaching experience. There was the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year, and we're using that data to kind of just see how our students are growing. How are they moving throughout that school year, right? So these are more universal. We're talking about SEL screeners or what as well. They're more spread out throughout the school year to kind of gauge and see how our student body is progressing. We always want to ensure, that it's, again, evidence-based core instruction. But one word that I'm going to mention, and you're going to see a lot within the next couple of slides here, is that fidelity piece. We want to ensure that we're implementing our instruction throughout all of the tiers with fidelity, because a lot of times, we without that fidelity, without that consistency, our initiatives, our practices will not be sustainable, and they'll begin to, just fall apart. So ensuring with fidelity, we are implementing our instruction. All right. The next tier two, and as you see here at the top of your screen, I really like how it gives a visual of how this equation is beginning to form. So we have our tier one core instruction that all of our students are going to receive. But now for tier two, this is more supplemental targeted instruction for a small group of students. Now, as you see on the left-hand side, it's kind of, Patrick, I like how he mentions it's like a volcano cake, right? It's just starting to layer. So again, not saying that the students who are going to receive tier two supports are not going to receive the tier one. Again, that's still in place. This is just another layer of support that small group of students will receive, whether it be in academics or SEL components or behavioral aspects. All right. So we know that this supplemental support is effective if at least 70 to 80% of our students are improving their performance and meeting those benchmarks. So again, some guiding questions to kind of get you thinking and reflecting on your tier two supports. And as you're moving forward, where are the students performing now? Where do we want them to be? Have we discussed how long of time, how long of a gap do we have to get them there? And how much do we want to see them grow, on a monthly basis, right? When we're having those periodic check-ins. This last question here too is one that really gets me thinking when I reflect on my practices. What resources did we have or do we have available for our students, to help them move, and at what rate are we going to want them to move? So again, this is just supplemental instruction on top of the core tier one instruction that the students are still receiving. On the next slide, you're going to see some tier two key elements. So as you see, assessment, that data evaluation is in all of the tiers, right? But with progress monitoring for those tier two supports, we're doing it a little more frequently than we would do at tier one. So instead of it being just quarterly, spread out throughout the school year, this is more on a monthly basis, because again, we're trying to see, we're providing more intensive supports for that small group of students. So we want to see how they are progressing at meeting those goals, right? Again, as I said, you're going to see evidence-based, but also the fidelity piece is so important throughout our entire framework, and especially when we're looking at implementing instruction for our students. All right. So finally, we have our tier three supports. And again, as you see, the equation is continuing to build. We still have our core tier one, We now have perhaps a small group of students that are going to need some supplemental supports. But when we talk about tier 3, this is more intensive, individualized support. So again, these students are still receiving tier 1, tier 2, but now they need a little bit more. And these supports and services are more intensive and individualized for those specific students. So again, we know that these tier 3 supports are effective if we see those individual students moving towards meeting those benchmarks. And as we set those progress monitoring goals, how are they moving? At what rate are they moving? Ensuring, and that this all, I hope you guys are starting to see how it all ties in the entire framework, because when we're having those database decision making, problem solving meetings, whether it be for an entire group of students, but now even moving through from tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, now we're looking to really hone in on individual instruction for specific students. So some guiding questions, as you see, it kind of went from a whole to small to now individualized. Where is that student performing? Where do we want him to be? How long do we have to get him there? So again, similar format, but now we went just to more individualized for a specific student. All right. On the next screen, you will see that similar, as the other slides, our progress monitoring here, though, we went from a monthly basis for those tier 2 supports. Now we're looking on a weekly basis. How is that specific individual student adapting and moving and growing with the supports that we have, whether it be in academics or behavioral supports? So this is a much more frequent check-in and progress monitoring that we're having with those individualized students to see how are they moving towards meeting their goals. And again, as always, that fidelity piece is essential, super crucial, important, key, just component of our instruction in all of the tiers. All right. So that was a quick just overview of the 3 tiers. Now we have this document here, and I'll give you guys a brief couple of seconds here to just kind of just take this in. And what we have here is a nice, that our team put together. It's a nice placemat per se, or organizing chart, graphic organizer that can kind of help you within your local practice see, okay, what supports do we have for academics in all of the tiers? What are some behavioral supports that we have in all of the tiers? What are SEL components that we have in all of the tiers? And as you see, some of these things, some of these strategies and resources and models are in all of the levels. So for example, you'll see UDL in all of them, so this document is actually available in the Padlet in the resources. It's not you can't fill it out online. It's not editable, but you can definitely download. Thanks, Patrick, for pulling that up. Yep. And feel free, we'll take this back to your local practice and sit with your MTSS, your school-based leadership team, and really have a good discussion to say, hey, what do we have in tier 1 for academics? What are all of our students getting behaviorally? That's where our PBIS ties in, right? Those social skills, right? But then this will really help you kind of see, where are we lacking a couple of, what are some resources that we maybe don't have in place? What can we look to add on? But really, as you're filling this document out, reflecting and thinking, Patrick and I were just having a conversation the other day, we often say we have tons of interventions for tier 2, tons of interventions for tier 3, but are they really working? Are these really narrowing down, and we found that this really helps buildings and districts, narrowing down, to maybe that core group of interventions at each level in each tier that are really working for our students, that we have seen them, make progress. So again, this resource is available in the Padlet, so feel free to take this and use it with your teams in your local practice. All right. So on the next slide here, you're probably wondering, where, okay, Victor, this sounds great and all, but where do these services and supports fit in? And as you see, throughout all of the tiers, you can provide specially designed instruction for your students in all of the tiers. So it's not just necessarily saying that, oh, in tier 3, we're going to look to provide some SDI, or in tier 2. No, in all of the tiers, you can look to meet the needs of all of your learners, whether you can provide accommodations, differentiate your instruction using UDL, multiple means of representation and engagement in all of the tiers, ensuring that in all of our tiers, we have culturally responsive practice, evidence-based practice, instruction that is in aligned to our standards. Okay, so this is a real nice visual that I like, because it really just helps you think, it not just tier 2, tier 3, but more of a global approach, that these specially designed instruction, these supports that we have for our students, are in all of our tiers. It all aligns together, and it's not necessarily just a special ed teacher that can provide specially designed instruction. It could be your Title One, your ELL teacher, your gen ed teachers, the high ability teacher, your instructional coaches can look to provide these supports in all of the tiers for all of our students. All right. On the next slide, well, let's see. What are you thinking, Patrick? We've got about 13 minutes left. Do you want to maybe give them, see if they have any ideas that they have for the tiers to type in the chat box, or do you want to go ahead and try and talk a little bit about implementation science?
I think we could maybe give them about a minute.
Minute or so? All right,
Sure.
sounds
We'll
good.
play part of a song.
All right. And again, guys, just feel free to share out, because we're hoping, that this can kind of just glean a light on what are some other practices that some of the other districts throughout Indiana are using. So we'll give, as Patrick said, about a minute or so to type in the chat box and let us know what are some of those structures, those assets, procedures, practices that you already have in place for MTII.
Okay, looks like we've got a few
going
comments here
Mm-hmm.
on some of the interventions that are being used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So again,
scripted intervention programs, relying on
funding,
aids,
resources, yeah. Like somebody mentioned, all teachers can implement and provide those supports. A wider spectrum, indeed, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Much more global approach for meeting the needs of our students and our learners, So thank you guys so much for sharing. So Patrick, if you want to go ahead and move on, we could
Sure.
go ahead and talk a little bit about implementation and wrap things up for them.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about implementation considerations, and I think it's kind of been alluded to it a few times throughout this presentation, is that the implementation is really key. It can really make or break this whole system, and really anything, any initiative or innovation that you're implementing, you need to make sure it's implemented, of course, with fidelity. And I think, one of the main reasons why interventions fail is because either they're never implemented in the first place, or they're not implemented as intended, or as they were designed, or as they were expected to be implemented based on what the team's deciding needs to be done. A lot of times it's a communication issue. A lot of times it's many of the different barriers pertaining to those domains that we've talked about earlier. Maybe there's some structural issues, some scheduling issues, all of those things that we kind of touched on all play into the implementation. So I just want to give you an opportunity to start thinking about your experiences with implementation, maybe not with MTSS, but with anything in general that you've been doing, any initiative or anything that you've been using in your buildings. What's been successful, and what are some examples of things that have not been successful, right? And what are some of the commonalities, or what are some of the differences in how those things were implemented? What's been successful in your buildings, and what are the key components that led to that success that maybe had hindered the success of some other things that maybe had not been implemented well? A lot of times I think districts can come up with their own conclusions as to why something failed. And we might not always know the root cause of why something happened, but usually it's pretty apparent in the way something was rolled out, in an initiative was maybe not followed through. Maybe there wasn't fidelity. There weren't any observations on making sure it was done properly. Maybe there's a program that was purchased that ended up just sitting on a shelf where only one teacher used it, and they've been using it for years and years and years, and they've been singing its praises to everybody else, and nobody's listening because maybe they didn't get the same pitch when it was originally purchased, or whatever it happens to be. we know that the levels of implementation or the quality of the implementation has varied quite a bit over the years with many districts. And we know the things that are working for a reason, because we made it a priority, or we provided the proper resources to make sure that it was successful. So going to use an example here a little bit. This graphic showing these blue circles. They kind of represent here in this illustration any evidence-based practices or evidence-based interventions that are initiated in a school or a district. And I'm sure this is probably going to look a little familiar to you if you think of this as an analogy with these blue circles. You see one coming in on the top left of the screen, and the intent here is for this evidence-based practice or evidence-based intervention to reach all the way at the end here, at the very end. But you'll notice that none of these blue circles end up making it all the way to the end, right? We don't see the improved outcomes for all students in a lot of cases. And as I mentioned, a lot of times it falls apart because we don't have the communication channels established, or we don't have the resources, whether it be the data evaluation system. We're not using a problem-solving process. We don't have the leadership on board that we need to make sure that this is sustained with fidelity. So there are varying reasons why an intervention can fail, and there's varying reasons why any innovation can fail or cannot be implemented as it was intended. And we talk about this in the context of the domains that we mentioned, but also we need to think about the stages of implementation and the pieces that need to be in place to make sure implementation is successful. So we'll just talk a little bit, just for a couple minutes, about the essentials of implementation science and the pieces you need to have in place, these elements that are really essential to making sure that a program, a practice, an intervention, an initiative is sustainable. So you want to make sure you've got the vision, the skills, the incentives, the resources, and the action plan. That's how you're going to get change and sustainable change. But you'll notice on some of these rows beneath that top row where you're seeing the change is taking place, when you have any one of those pieces missing, you're going to have some issues, right? So without the vision, you've got skills, incentives, resources, and action plan, but you don't have the vision, you're going to get confusion, right? And the reason why is because that vision really tells you the why you're here, why you're using this, right? There's no agreement on what the goal is or what the destination is. Sometimes MTSS is rolled out that way. RTI has been rolled out that way. I don't know why we're doing it. Confusion as to goal is of this. So we need to make sure that we have a common understanding of what our vision is. What do we intend to produce at the end of this? What is the intent? The row below this, you see, okay, we vision, incentives, resources, and action plan, but we don't have the skills. So without the skills, we get anxiety, and probably not a big surprise there, because that's really how we get the confidence that we need to really execute what we're expected to do. So that's really where the training, PD, and coaching, providing feedback, doing observations. We need to make sure that they have the skills they need to implement what we're expecting people to implement. Without the incentives, we're going to have resistance, right? And we're not going to have the buy-in or the motivation that we need. So it's really important to make sure that we're incentivizing a lot of those individuals that are contributing towards implementing this innovation that we're expecting them to do. Without the resources, we're going to have frustration, right? Because they know what they need to do, they know where they're going, but they don't have the resources that they need to do it, right? So that's where the resource inventory comes into play. That's a really good place to start, at least, so you know what you have right now, and then you can see what pieces you're missing, what you need to fill in, and start having conversations about the resource needs that you have. And so the last one, what are we missing? The action plan. We've got the vision, we've got the skills and incentives and the resources, but we don't have that action plan. So we get what we call a treadmill. We're just moving in place, right? We don't know how to get where we need to get. We know where we want to be, but we don't have that action plan. And the problem solving process will really help you develop that action plan you need, so you know what checkpoints and benchmarks to look for along the way to make sure that you're on that right track. And I think of it as a roadmap, right? You know where you need to get to, but you have no map. And the action plan really acts as that map for you. So that was a kind of a real quick introduction to how implementation science plays into all of this, but it plays into pretty much anything that you're implementing. So we've talked about a lot. We've talked about the domains. We've talked about all these different components that are necessary to make this work, not just that triangle with the 3 tiers in it. All of those other domains really help support those interventions that you're providing. And in addition to tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, considering tier 1 interventions. A lot of times, as Victor mentioned, that's overlooked, and we don't think about interventions in terms of tier 1 or core interventions, but a lot of times that needs to be the very first discussion you have with your problem solving meetings is, let's look at our tier 1. If our tier 1 isn't working, maybe we need to develop some interventions for everybody and call that a tier 1 intervention and do some tier 1 problem solving. But regardless of what you're doing, where you are in your implementation, a lot of you are in different places based on some of the comments that we've gotten in the chat box. A lot of you have been using MTSS, but a lot of you are not familiar with it at all, or maybe you're using some pieces as you've learned through this training. So what can you start doing today? There's various entry points into either entering into an MTSS or dipping your feet into it or adjusting what you're already doing. So take the pieces and the chunks that you think are manageable to take on, or those that you can leverage. These are just some examples of things that you could maybe start doing. Don't feel like you have to take on that whole thing. Take one little bite, one little piece at a time, those that are manageable. Otherwise, it might be a little bit overwhelming. And that's not the intent here. And the intent of MTSS is to make your lives easier, to make it easier for you to do your jobs and to provide the services and supports to students for those students that need them, right? And when they need them. So looking at your resources, looking at making sure you've got leadership teams, making sure you've got the structure in place, communication, all of that stuff. Maybe you're missing some social emotional stuff. I know there was some comments in here about somebody was a little bit more familiar with the social emotional and behavior and actually need a little bit more help with academics. So we don't want to assume that that's where the need is. So a lot of different entry points, as we mentioned. We've got tools to help you kind of guide you through those conversations within those domains. Also important for those of you working at the school level to look at your school improvement plan and see how an MTSS can align with some of the goals that you have in your school improvement plans. I'm sure there are some principals or some folks here that are in leadership at the building level that are probably have some pretty good familiarity with the school improvement plan or have been involved in working on that and some of those goals. Just see what you can do to leverage what your goals are in your school improvement plan and the processes that you've used in developing those, and see if you can use some of those or replicate those in an MTSS, because I think it's going to make it a lot easier for you. All right. Well, it looks like we're out of time here. It's right at 10:30 Central Time, 11:30 Eastern. So we've got a lot of resources here. All these slides, as Victor mentioned, are in that Padlet site that we get. That Padlet website is going to be good, I think, forever, right? It's not going away.
Yeah.
So you should have access to that at any time. And you can check out these resources in addition to the ones that we've provided in there. And see what else we need here. IDOE resources, our other trainings that we've got, and then here's our contact information. So I'm Patrick, and Victor, of course, is the other guy who's got the beard. I have a little bit of a beard, but nothing that compares to his. So this is our contact information. Feel free to email call, text if you want. These are mobile numbers. And let us know if you have any questions or need any supports or additional trainings, or if you want us to work with your school or district directly, we're happy to do so.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just posted in the chat box. We have an evaluation link. It'll take you less than a minute to fill out. It'll just give Patrick and I some feedback on how you felt today's session went. Again, we covered a lot in an hour and a half here. So I know some of you guys are like, oh my gosh, where do we begin? Where do we start? Feel free to, just baby steps and just look at, take these resources back to your local practice. And again, feel free to reach out to Patrick and I. We enjoy working within districts with local buildings or individual buildings with the entire leadership team from a district. Copy down our information. Feel free to reach out to us. We have other resources, and as Patrick mentioned, specific other trainings, that we do with school-based leadership teams. Another thing we want to mention before we head on out is I know we did have one group that was watching together. So this slide here is for group attendees. Feel free, one of your individuals from your team, reach out to our colleague Gail Ringwalt. There's her email on the screen. It is also in your PowerPoint. Send her an email and say, hey, a group of 5 of us watched together. Here are her names. Here are, and list the emails. And then she can send you guys a direct certificate of attendance. And then also you will have a recording of this presentation that will come as well. So thank you guys so much for spending time with us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, definitely feel free to reach out. And yeah, we can wait about, I don't know, Patrick, if you want to go back to our contact information, give them about another minute. If you
Sure.
guys already have our information, feel free to leave the session. We'll wait about another minute or so before we close out. I'll go ahead and post that evaluation link in here one more time. And yeah, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you guys, definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for attending. And
Mhm.
if you, like we said, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us, or, if you want us to jump in on an initial building leadership team meeting or problem solving meeting, feel free to contact us. I mean, Zoom makes it a lot easier,
Mhm.
to jump into a meeting if you have any questions or just want to get our input on any of that.
Yep.
We're happy to help with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, our calendars, we've got meetings, just with individual buildings. I got one tomorrow morning where we're just talking about next steps on implementation. So feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you guys so much, as Patrick mentioned, for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us. We hope that you found it beneficial and helped kind of, just open up your eyes a little bit more and view MTSS through a different, lens and perspective. So, again, if you already have the evaluation link, you guys go ahead and end and leave out. We'll be ending the session within the next 30 seconds or so here. Thank you so much.